The lawyer's voice had that particular flatness that came from reading the same phrases too many times. Estate distribution, final wishes, legal obligations. The words tumbled out in a careful rhythm designed to sound neutral, as if neutrality could soften the weight of what they actually meant. Someone was dead, and what remained of their existence was being divided into portions that could be listed, valued, and transferred. She sat in the back corner of the conference room, hands folded in her lap, listening without really hearing. The chair was expensive, the kind that adjusted in 6 different ways, but it still felt uncomfortable. Everything about the room felt designed to make grief manageable. Contained within wood paneling and soft lighting that never quite reached the corners. Around the table, her siblings sat with varying degrees of attention. Her older brother checked his phone periodically, the screen glowing faintly against his face. Her younger sister picked at her nails, eyes distant. The middle brother stared at the ceiling tiles, as if counting them might make time move faster. Their grandmother was gone. The woman who had raised 3 of them when their mother couldn't, who had held the family together through divorces and bankruptcies and all the small catastrophes that accumulate over decades. She was gone, and now strangers in suits were deciding what pieces of her life went to whom. The lawyer turned another page. Most of the estate was straightforward. The house would be sold, proceeds divided equally. Bank accounts, already modest, would be distributed according to percentages that had been carefully calculated. A few stocks, not worth much. Insurance policies that barely covered funeral costs. Then came the personal items. This was where estates always became complicated, the lawyer had explained earlier. People attached meaning to objects that had no market value. Fights erupted over photographs, jewelry, furniture that was worth less than the cost of moving it. Her grandmother had tried to avoid that. She had left specific instructions, items assigned to specific people, presumably for reasons that made sense to her at the time. The older brother got the watch their grandfather had worn, a heavy silver piece that hadn't worked in 20 years. The younger sister received the jewelry box, modest but sentimental. The middle brother got tools from the garage, wrenches and hammers that had built and repaired a lifetime of small projects. When the lawyer reached her name, she straightened slightly, pulled back into the present by the sound of her own identity. What she inherited was furniture, specifically an armoire. The reaction was immediate. Her older brother snorted, then tried to turn it into a cough. Her younger sister's eyes widened before she looked down, suppressing something that might have been laughter or disbelief. The middle brother just shook his head slowly, a gesture that said everything without requiring words. Even the lawyer paused, glancing up from the documents as if checking whether this was correct, whether perhaps a mistake had been made in the transcription. But there was no mistake. The armoire was hers. Her grandmother had been specific about it. The tall wooden cabinet that had stood in the corner of the bedroom for as long as anyone could remember, doors that stuck, drawers that scraped, finish that had darkened and cracked with age. It was the kind of furniture people put at estate sales with a sign that said, "Free to good home," and still struggled to give away. She felt heat rise in her face, not from anger exactly, but from the particular shame that came with public humiliation, even when the public was just family. Her older brother broke the silence first. His voice carried that tone of false sympathy that was somehow worse than open mockery. He said he hoped she had a truck big enough to haul it away. He said their grandmother must have had a sense of humor they never fully appreciated. He said at least firewood was always useful. The younger sister tried to soften it, suggesting that maybe the armoire had sentimental value, that perhaps their grandmother had stored important memories there. But her voice wavered, and the doubt underneath was obvious. The middle brother said nothing, which was its own form of comment. She sat through the rest of the reading in silence, barely registering what followed. When it finally ended and people began gathering their things, preparing to leave, she remained seated. The lawyer approached her carefully, as if worried she might be upset. He explained that the armoire was currently in storage, that it had been moved from the house before the sale. She could arrange pickup whenever convenient. There was no rush. His kindness made it worse somehow. Outside, in the parking lot, her siblings clustered near their cars. She could see them through the window, talking, gesturing, She knew without hearing what they were saying. The unfairness of it. The strangeness. Why would their grandmother leave her, specifically her, a piece of furniture that was barely functional when others received things with actual worth, actual meaning? She waited until they drove away before walking to her own car. The drive home was long enough for the initial shock to settle into something heavier. She thought about her grandmother, about the last time they had spoken. It had been brief, a phone call on a Tuesday evening. Her grandmother's voice had sounded thin, tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. She had asked about work, about bills, about whether things were getting any easier. The conversation had been ordinary, forgettable. There had been no hint of goodbye, no cryptic messages or final wisdom. Just the kind of exchange that happened 1,000 times between people who cared about each other but didn't always know what to say. Now she wondered if she had missed something. Some signal, some meaning hidden in ordinary words. But memory offered nothing useful, only the dull ache of hindsight. At home, she sat at the kitchen table and stared at the notice the lawyer had given her. The storage facility address, the unit number, the access code. Everything necessary to claim her inheritance. She almost laughed. Inheritance. The word carried weight, suggested value, importance. What she had inherited was a broken piece of furniture that nobody wanted. Her apartment was small, one bedroom, with a living room barely large enough for a couch and a television. There was no space for an armoire. Even if there had been space, it would have been absurd. The thing was massive, heavy, outdated. It belonged in houses with high ceilings and rooms that had specific purposes. Keeping it would mean rearranging everything, getting rid of other furniture, living around an object that served no practical function. Selling it would be pointless. Nobody bought that kind of furniture anymore. Estate sale dealers would take it, maybe, but only if she paid them. That night, she lay awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling. The inheritance felt like a message she couldn't decode. Her grandmother had been deliberate about everything. She planned meals days in advance, kept calendars color-coded by importance, never made decisions without thinking through consequences. The idea that she would randomly assign her only granddaughter a worthless piece of furniture made no sense. Unless it wasn't random. Unless there was a reason. The thought refused to leave once it arrived. It sat at the edge of her mind through the following days, persistent and irritating. She tried to dismiss it as wishful thinking, the desperate hope that maybe she hadn't been forgotten after all, that maybe there was meaning beneath the apparent slight. But doubt worked both ways, and the more she tried to convince herself it didn't matter, the more the question demanded attention. Finally, she called the storage facility. The woman on the phone was cheerful in that professional way that suggested she had answered this exact question hundreds of times before. Yes, the unit was paid through the end of the month. Yes, she could access it any time during business hours. Yes, they had hand trucks available if needed. She made an appointment for Saturday morning, telling herself it was just to confirm what she already knew. She would look at the armoire, acknowledge that it was exactly what everyone thought it was, and then decide what to do with it. Simple, practical, the kind of decision that required no emotional investment. Saturday arrived gray and cold, the kind of morning that felt like the world was withholding commitment to either season. She dressed in old clothes, layers that could be shed if physical work got warm. The drive to the storage facility took 40 minutes, enough time for the doubt to sharpen. She imagined her siblings hearing about this, about her actually going to look at the armoire. The jokes would write themselves. She almost turned around twice. The facility was larger than she expected, rows of identical garage-style units stretching into the distance. She found the office, signed paperwork, received a key. The woman behind the counter pointed toward the far section, explaining that larger items were stored there, that she should take her time. The words felt ominous in a way they probably weren't meant to. The unit was at the end of a row, number 247. The door was metal, industrial, marked with the kind of wear that came from years of use. She unlocked it and pulled upward. The door resisted, then rose with a grinding complaint. Inside was darkness. She fumbled for the light switch the woman had mentioned, found it, pressed. A single bulb flickered to life, casting harsh shadows across the space. The armoire stood against the back wall, exactly as enormous as she remembered. Taller than her by at least a foot, wider than her arm span, made from dark wood that looked almost black in the dim light. It dominated the small space, making everything else feel cramped and insignificant. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, just looking. From this distance, it appeared worse than she remembered. The finish was cracked in dozens of places, spiderwebbing across the surface. One of the doors hung slightly crooked, the hinges bent or broken. The decorative carving along the top had chipped in places, leaving gaps where detail had once been. This was what her grandmother had left her. This broken, forgotten thing. She stepped inside, letting the door close partially behind her. The air smelled of dust and old wood, the particular scent of objects that hadn't been moved in years. She approached slowly, almost reluctantly, as if the armoire might somehow judge her for doubting its value. Up close, the damage was even more apparent. The wood was scratched, gouged in places, marked by decades of use and neglect. She reached out and touched the surface, expecting it to feel rough, splintered. Instead, it was smooth, worn down by hands that had opened and closed these doors thousands of times. The door handle was brass, tarnished to a dull green. She pulled gently, expecting resistance. The door opened easily, smoothly, with a whisper of movement that seemed wrong for something this old. Inside was emptiness. Shelves, plain and simple, nothing remarkable. She opened the other door. Same result. Empty shelves, dust gathered in corners, nothing hidden, nothing special. The drawers at the bottom were stuck. She pulled harder, felt one give way suddenly, nearly stumbling backward with the force of it. The drawer was empty. So were the others, once she managed to work them free. She stood there, breathing slightly harder from the effort, staring at the interior of the armoire, as if expecting something to materialize. Nothing did. This was it. This was her inheritance. A large, broken, empty piece of furniture that would cost more to move than it could ever be worth. She felt something crack inside her chest, not dramatically but quietly. The kind of break that happened when hope, however small, finally exhausted itself. She sat down on the concrete floor of the storage unit, back against the wall, and let the disappointment wash through her. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was about being seen, being valued, being remembered as more than an afterthought. Her siblings had received items that meant something, objects their grandmother had chosen carefully to represent connection, love, shared history. She had received furniture nobody wanted. The message felt clear, even if it wasn't intended. She had mattered less. Time passed unmarked. Eventually, the cold of the concrete seeped through her clothes, forcing her back to awareness. She stood, brushed dust from her pants, and looked at the armoire one last time. She would call an estate dealer on Monday. Someone would take it. Eventually, maybe they would refurbish it, sell it to someone who appreciated old things. Maybe it would end up in a landfill. Either way, it would stop being her problem. She was reaching for the light switch when she noticed it. A seam, not in the wood itself, but in the back panel of the armoire. A line so thin, she had almost missed it, running vertically along one side, perfectly straight. She stopped, hand frozen mid-reach. Furniture backs weren't supposed to have seams like that. They were single pieces, nailed or glued into place, never meant to be removed. She stepped closer, examining the line more carefully. It was deliberate, precise, cut with intention rather than formed by damage or age. Her heart began beating faster, though she didn't yet know why. She ran her finger along the seam, feeling for anything unusual. The wood was smooth, unbroken, giving no indication of how the panel might be accessed. She pressed against it, testing. Solid. Immovable. She tried pushing different sections, feeling increasingly foolish as nothing happened. Then her hand found a small depression, barely noticeable, hidden in the carved detail along the interior side. It wasn't a button or a latch, just a slight indentation in the wood. But when she pressed it, something clicked. The sound was quiet, mechanical, precise. The back panel shifted, moving inward perhaps half an inch. She pulled her hand away quickly, heart now pounding in earnest. For several seconds, she just stared, trying to understand what she was seeing. Then, carefully, she reached forward and pulled at the edge of the panel. It swung open. Not all the way, but enough to reveal a space behind it. A hidden compartment, maybe 3 inches deep, running the full height and width of the armoire. The darkness inside was complete, offering no hints about what it might contain. She fumbled for her phone, hands shaking slightly, and activated the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating what lay hidden. Her breath stopped. The compartment wasn't empty. The light from her phone trembled slightly, casting shifting shadows across the hidden compartment. What she saw didn't make immediate sense. Her brain struggled to categorize the shapes, to assign meaning to objects that seemed impossibly out of place in the back of a forgotten piece of furniture. The compartment was lined with fabric, old velvet or something similar, darkened by time, but still intact. And pressed against that fabric, arranged with careful precision, were envelopes. Dozens of them. They were old, that much was immediately clear. The paper had yellowed to the color of aged parchment, and the corners showed wear from handling. But they weren't scattered or thrown in carelessly. They were stacked, organized, each one placed with deliberate attention. She reached forward slowly, as if sudden movement might cause them to dissolve, and pulled out the first envelope. It was sealed, the flap tucked in rather than glued, and it was heavy. Heavier than paper should be. Her hands fumbled as she opened it, the old paper crackling softly in the silence of the storage unit. Inside was another envelope, this one made of different material, more modern, protective. And inside that was paper, not ordinary paper. Her breath caught as she pulled it free and held it up to the light. It was a certificate of some kind. Official, ornate borders framed dense text. And at the center, numbers stood out in careful script. Denomination, $10,000. Date, 1934. She stared at it, mind racing to understand. This wasn't plain money or a reproduction. The weight, the texture, the specific details all pointed to authenticity. This was a bond, a United States government bond from 1934. She set it down carefully on the floor beside her and reached for another envelope. Same result. Another bond, different serial number, same denomination, same year. Her hands moved faster now, pulling envelopes from the compartment, opening them one after another. Each envelope contained the same thing. Bonds. Some were $10,000 denominations. Others were $5,000. A few were $1,000. All of them dated from the 1930s. All of them preserved in protective sleeves. All of them arranged with meticulous care. She lost count after the first dozen, her mind unable to keep track of the numbers that were beginning to accumulate in her head. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen. People didn't hide fortunes inside furniture and forget about them. But even as she thought it, she knew it wasn't forgotten. Her grandmother had known. Had to have known. The hidden compartment wasn't accidental. The careful preservation wasn't coincidence. Someone had placed these here deliberately, had arranged them with purpose, had sealed them away, and left instructions that this specific piece of furniture go to this specific person. Her. The realization hit harder than the discovery itself. This was intentional. Her grandmother had left her this, had trusted her with it, had seen something in her that her siblings apparently lacked. She sat surrounded by open envelopes and old paper, trying to make her brain function properly. The bonds represented money, obviously, but how much? She had no frame of reference for what Depression-era bonds might be worth now, decades after their issue date. Were they still valid? Had they matured? Did the government still honor them? The questions piled up faster than she could process them, each one spawning 3 more. Her phone buzzed, startling her so badly she nearly dropped it. A text from her older brother. Just checking if you survived picking up your inheritance. Laughing emoji. Fire emoji. She stared at it, then at the papers surrounding her, then back at the phone. The urge to respond, to send a photo, to prove them all wrong was almost overwhelming. But something stopped her. Instinct, maybe. or the memory of how quickly her siblings had mocked her at the lawyer's office, or the understanding that whatever this was, it was bigger than sibling rivalry. She gathered the bonds carefully, sliding them back into their protective envelopes, then into the outer envelopes, maintaining the organization she'd found. Her hands were steadier now, moving with purpose rather than shock. She needed to get these somewhere safe. Needed time to think, to research, to understand what she actually had. The storage unit suddenly felt exposed, vulnerable. Anyone could walk by. The door was only partially closed. She worked faster. When the last bond was secured, she did a final sweep of the compartment with her phone's light. Empty now, except for the velvet lining and shadows. But wait, there was something else. Pressed flat against the very bottom of the compartment, easy to miss in the initial shock of discovery, was a single piece of paper. Not a bond, just paper, folded once with writing on the outside. Her name, in her grandmother's handwriting. She pulled it free with hands that had started shaking again. The paper was newer than the bonds, regular stationery, slightly crumpled as if it had been handled nervously before being placed here. She unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was shaky but legible, the letters formed with care despite obvious difficulty. It was dated 3 months before her grandmother's death. "My dearest girl," it began. "If you're reading this, then you found what I left for you. I'm sorry for the strange way of doing this, but I had my reasons. The bonds belonged to my father. He bought them during the Depression when the government needed money and promised good returns. Then the war came, and other things happened, and somehow they were forgotten. I found them years ago, hidden in the attic, and I've kept them safe ever since." She paused, wiping her eyes, surprised to find them wet. The letter continued in the same careful script. "I watched you struggle these past years. Watched you work 2 jobs to keep your apartment. Watched you help your siblings when they needed it, even when you didn't have much yourself. You never complained, never asked for anything. You just kept going, kept trying, kept being kind even when life wasn't kind to you. That's rare. That matters. Your siblings will be fine. They have good jobs, stable lives, partners who support them. They don't need what I'm giving you. But you do. Not because you're weak. Because you've been strong for too long without help. This is your chance. Your freedom. Use it wisely. Don't tell them until you're ready. They won't understand at first. Maybe they never will. But this was always meant for you." The letter ended with a simple signature and a postscript. "The bonds are called Liberty Bonds and Victory Bonds. They're worth investigating. I love you. I'm proud of you. You're going to be fine now." She read it 3 times, each time finding new weight in words that seemed simple on the surface. Her grandmother had seen her, had understood, had planned this moment with the same careful deliberation she'd applied to everything in her life. The drive home was a blur. She kept the envelopes in a cloth shopping bag she found in her trunk, trying to make them look as unremarkable as possible. Every car that pulled up beside her at stoplights felt like a threat. Every person walking past her parked car seemed suspicious. By the time she reached her apartment, paranoia had settled in fully. She carried the bag inside like it might explode, locked the door behind her, drew the curtains closed. For the rest of the day, she did research. The internet was surprisingly helpful once she figured out what questions to ask. Liberty bonds, she learned, were issued by the U.S. government during World War I to fund the war effort. Victory bonds came later, near the end of the war. But the bonds in her grandmother's armoire weren't from World War I. They were from the 1930s, part of a different program, similar concept, but different era. Depression-era government securities. The value was harder to determine. The bonds had face values, the amounts printed on them. But they also had maturity dates and interest rates, compounding over decades. Some forums suggested that old government bonds, if never redeemed, could be worth many times their original face value. Others warned that the redemption process was complex, that authentication was required, that some old bonds were worthless if improperly stored or if certain conditions weren't met. She found a calculator online that attempted to estimate the value of old bonds based on issue date, denomination, and interest rate. She started entering numbers from the bonds she'd found. The first result made her stop breathing. The second made her set down her phone and walk away from it. The third brought her back, hands shaking, to verify what she was seeing. If the calculator was accurate, and if the bonds were genuine, and if they could be redeemed, the total value was extraordinary. She couldn't bring herself to believe it yet. The numbers were too large, too far removed from her reality. She lived in a world where $600 extra per month meant the difference between stability and crisis, where a surprise car repair could derail her budget for weeks. The numbers the calculator was showing her belonged to a different universe entirely, one where money stopped being a constant source of anxiety and became something abstract, almost theoretical. That night, she barely slept. Every small sound in the building made her sit up, alert, certain that somehow someone knew what she had. The bonds were hidden now, placed inside a locked file box she normally used for important documents, then shoved to the back of her closet under winter coats. It felt inadequate. Everything felt inadequate. She needed professional help. Needed someone who understood bonds and authentication and the legal process of redemption. But who? How did someone even begin that conversation? Monday morning came too slowly. She called in sick to work, something she rarely did, knowing that concentration would be impossible. Instead, she spent hours researching financial advisors, authentication services, estate lawyers. Every website looked legitimate. Every phone number could be answered by criminals. The paranoia was exhausting, but felt justified. She was a single woman with no real savings, no financial education, no network of wealthy friends to ask for advice. She was precisely the kind of person who could be taken advantage of easily. Finally, she found a name that appeared repeatedly in articles about historical financial instruments. A firm in the city that specialized in authenticating and valuing old stocks, bonds, and certificates. Their website was professional without being flashy, and their credentials seemed legitimate. She stared at the phone number for 20 minutes before calling. The receptionist was polite but businesslike. No, they couldn't provide valuations over the phone. Yes, they required in-person authentication. Yes, there was a consultation fee. Could she bring the items in? The appointment was set for Thursday. 3 days away. 3 days of carrying the secret alone, of moving through her ordinary life while knowing nothing about it was ordinary anymore. She went to work Tuesday and Wednesday, performing her job with mechanical efficiency while her mind spun elsewhere. Her co-workers noticed nothing. Her manager commented that she seemed distracted. She blamed allergies, poor sleep, stress. All technically true. Her siblings texted periodically. Her older brother sent another joke about the Armoire. Her younger sister asked if she'd picked it up yet, offering to help move it if needed. The middle brother remained silent, which was typical. She responded with vague deflections, maintaining normalcy while feeling like she was vibrating at a different frequency than the rest of the world. Every interaction felt surreal, like she was acting in a play where only she knew the script had changed. Thursday arrived cold and clear. She dressed carefully, not too casual, not too formal, trying to look like someone who might reasonably own valuable historical items without looking like someone who definitely did. The bonds were in her bag, wrapped in tissue paper, protected as well as she could manage. The train ride into the city felt endless. Every person who looked at her seemed suspicious. Every bag that bumped against hers sent adrenaline spiking through her system. The firm's office was on the 14th floor of a building that had seen better decades, but maintained an air of dignified persistence. The lobby was wood-paneled and quiet, with paintings of old financial districts and historical market scenes. The receptionist directed her to a conference room where a man in his 60s waited, glasses perched on his nose, expression pleasant but reserved. He introduced himself as Mr. Harrington, senior authenticator. She sat across from him, the bag in her lap, suddenly uncertain how to begin. He seemed to sense her hesitation and offered a gentle smile. Most people who came to see him, he explained, felt nervous. Historical financial instruments existed in a strange space between family heirlooms and potential assets. The emotional weight complicated everything. She should take her time. There was no rush. The kindness in his voice made something in her chest loosen slightly. She pulled out the first envelope and slid it across the table. He opened it with practiced efficiency, removing the bond and holding it up to the light. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture sharpened. He examined it from multiple angles, then set it down and picked up a magnifying glass from the desk. Minutes passed in silence. She waited, barely breathing. Finally, he set down a magnifying glass and looked at her directly. This was authentic, he said, without question. The paper was correct for the era. The printing technique matched government standards from that period. The serial numbers were consistent with records he could access. This was a genuine Depression-era government bond. The watermark was correct. The signatures, though faded, matched authenticated examples. This was real. She pulled out another envelope, then another. With each bond she revealed, his expression grew more carefully controlled. By the 10th bond, he asked her to stop, not because he doubted the others, but because he needed to understand the full scope of what she had. How many were there? She told him. Approximately 50 envelopes, each containing at least one bond, some containing multiple. All from the same era, all preserved in similar condition. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he excused himself and left the room. She sat alone, heart pounding, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. Was he calling security? The police? Would they confiscate the bonds, claim they were stolen or illegal? Minutes stretched out painfully. When he returned, another person was with him. A woman in her 40s, introduced as Ms. Chun, the firm's senior valuation specialist. Together, they examined every bond she'd brought. The process took hours. They cataloged each one, noting denomination, date, condition, serial numbers. They cross-referenced databases, made phone calls to verify information, consulted reference books that looked older than the bonds themselves. Through it all, they maintained professional composure, but she could see the excitement beneath. This was something unusual, something significant. When they finally finished, Ms. Chun asked her to sit down, even though she'd been sitting the entire time. The gesture itself was answer enough. What they were about to tell her was going to require being seated. Mr. Harrington opened a leather portfolio and removed several pages of notes. The bonds, he explained, were part of a series issued during the Depression as part of various government financing programs. They were rare now. Most had been redeemed decades ago. The few that remained were typically in poor condition or had issues with their provenance. These bonds, however, were pristine. The preservation was exceptional. More importantly, they'd never been redeemed. That meant they'd continued to accrue interest over the decades, compounding year after year according to the terms specified at their issue. The calculations were complex, involving interest rates that had changed multiple times, adjustments for inflation, legal precedents about long-dormant government securities. But the bottom line, the number that mattered, was this. Ms. Chun turned her computer screen so it faced her. The spreadsheet was detailed, full of numbers and formulas she didn't fully understand. But at the bottom, in a cell highlighted in yellow, was a total. $305,247,000. $305,247,000. She stared at it. The numbers didn't seem real. They couldn't be real. That was more money than made sense, more than she could conceptualize. That was lottery money, generational wealth money, the kind of sum that existed in news articles about billionaires and corporate mergers, not in the back of old furniture. Mr. Harrington spoke gently, explaining that the number was an estimate based on current government bond redemption protocols and historical precedent. The actual redemption process would be complex, involving the Treasury Department, authentication procedures, legal review. It could take months, possibly a year. But yes, he said, answering the question she couldn't voice. This was real. This was legitimate. She had just inherited over $300 million. The room tilted slightly. She gripped the edge of the table, forcing herself to breathe slowly, to stay present. Ms. Chin was talking about next steps, about lawyers they recommended, about security measures she should implement immediately. The words washed over her without quite penetrating. All she could think about was her grandmother, the woman who had lived modestly in a small house, who had clipped coupons and bought generic brands, who had quietly held onto a fortune for decades without telling anyone. Why? Why had she kept it secret? Why had she lived the way she had, working into her 70s, worrying about medical bills, refusing help from her children when they offered? The letter provided some answers, but not all. Maybe her grandmother had been afraid. Maybe she hadn't trusted anyone with the information. Maybe she'd been waiting for the right moment, the right person, and hadn't realized until near the end that the moment was now and the person was her struggling granddaughter. Mr. Harrington was asking her something. She forced herself to focus. Did she want them to handle the authentication paperwork? They worked with lawyers who specialized in exactly this type of situation. They could guide her through the process, handle communications with the Treasury Department, manage the legal complexities. Their fee would be percentage-based, calculated after redemption. Standard practice for this type of work. She nodded, unable to form words properly. Before she left, they gave her detailed instructions. She needed to store the bonds securely. A safety deposit box at a bank at minimum. She should not discuss this with anyone yet, not friends, not family, not on social media. The moment word got out, complications would multiply exponentially. People would come forward claiming ownership, relationships, debts owed. Distant relatives would appear. Scammers would target her. She needed to move carefully, deliberately, with professional guidance. She should also prepare herself for the emotional impact. Sudden wealth, even inherited wealth, changed everything. Relationships would shift. People would treat her differently once they knew. She would need to make decisions about things she'd never considered before. Taxes, investments, estate planning, security. The money would solve many problems, but create others. They had seen it before. The transition was never as simple as people imagined. She took the cards they offered, the business cards of lawyers and financial advisors and security consultants. She carefully packed the bonds back in her bag, now acutely aware of what she was carrying. The walk back to the train felt different than the walk there. The same streets, the same crowds, but she moved through them as something changed. Someone with a secret that weighed $300 million. On the train, she sat in a corner seat and stared out the window without seeing anything. Her phone buzzed repeatedly. Text messages from work, from friends, from her younger sister asking if she wanted to get dinner sometime. Normal life, continuing as if everything hadn't just shifted fundamentally beneath the surface. She responded mechanically, maintaining appearances while her mind spun in circles too wide to control. By the time she reached her apartment, exhaustion had set in. Not physical tiredness, but the deep fatigue that came from prolonged shock. She locked the door, set down the bag, and sat on her couch in the dark. No lights, no television, just silence and the weight of knowledge. Her grandmother's letter was still in her pocket, folded and creased from repeated reading. She pulled it out again, examining the handwriting in what little light came through the curtains. "You're going to be fine now." That's what the letter promised. But fine meant different things to different people. Fine meant paying rent without anxiety. Fine meant not choosing between groceries and medication. Fine meant security, stability, the absence of constant financial fear. What she had now went so far beyond fine that the word lost meaning. She had wealth. Real, transformative, life-altering wealth. And she had no idea what to do with it. The apartment felt smaller suddenly, cramped in a way it never had before. Not because it lacked space, but because she now understood viscerally that it was temporary. This place, this life, these constraints were all temporary. She could leave tomorrow, could buy a house, a car, could quit her job, could travel, could do anything. The possibilities stretched out endlessly, and instead of feeling liberating, they felt paralyzing. Too many choices. Too much change too quickly. She thought about her siblings, about the reading of the will, the laughter, the dismissive comments. They thought they'd received the valuable items. The watch, the jewelry, the tools. Things with sentimental value, modest monetary worth. They had no idea, and she couldn't tell them. Not yet. Maybe not for a long time. The knowledge created a wall between them that hadn't existed before. She was suddenly carrying a secret so large it changed the basic terms of every relationship she had. Her phone rang, startling her out of thought. Her older brother. She stared at the screen, watching it ring, unable to decide whether to answer. Finally, she did, keeping her voice carefully neutral. He wanted to know if she'd gotten rid of the Armoire yet. Said he knew a guy who hauled away furniture for cheap. She could probably get it done for under $100. He was trying to help, his tone implied. Trying to solve her problem. She told him she'd taken care of it. The Armoire was handled. He sounded surprised, asked what she'd done with it. She kept her answer vague. Found someone who wanted it, got it moved. He didn't press. The conversation shifted to other things, family gossip, complaints about work, the ordinary currency of sibling communication. She participated minimally, offering sounds of agreement at appropriate moments. When he hung up, she sat holding the phone, feeling the distance between them stretch wider. That night, she took the bonds to a bank and rented the largest safety deposit box they had. The process was simple, bureaucratic, blessedly normal. Forms to sign, ID to verify, a key to receive. The bank employee was professional and disinterested, treating this like any other transaction. She placed the bonds inside the metal box, closed it, locked it. The relief was immediate and profound. They were safe, secure, out of her apartment, out of her immediate responsibility. Walking home, she felt lighter despite everything. The bonds were real. The authentication was complete. The process was beginning. In a year, maybe less, her life would be completely different. But for now, for tonight, she was still herself. Still the person who worked 2 jobs and worried about bills and lived in a small apartment. The change was coming, inevitable and enormous, but it hadn't arrived yet. She still had time to figure out who she wanted to be when it did. At home, she made tea and sat at her small kitchen table. The letter from her grandmother was spread out before her, smooth, flat, the words familiar now from repeated readings. "I'm proud of you." That line caught her every time. Her grandmother had been proud, had seen her struggle and deemed it worthwhile, had trusted her with something so valuable it defied comprehension. The responsibility of that trust felt heavier than the money itself. She thought about her grandmother's life, the careful budgeting, the modest choices, the quiet dignity with which she'd approached everything. Had she been tempted? Had there been moments when she wanted to use the bonds, to cash them in and live differently? Or had the secret become so much a part of her identity that revealing it felt impossible? The questions had no answers now. The only person who could have explained was gone. But the letter offered clues. Her grandmother had understood what financial security meant because she'd never had it. Had understood what it meant to struggle because she'd done it her entire life. And she'd wanted something different for her granddaughter. Not wealth for its own sake, but freedom. Freedom from the constant anxiety that colored every decision, every plan, every dream. Freedom to choose rather than simply endure. The weeks that followed the authentication existed in a strange, suspended state. On the surface, nothing changed. She went to work, paid bills, lived in her small apartment, maintained the routines that had defined her life for years. But beneath that surface, everything had shifted. She moved through the world differently now, carrying knowledge that separated her from every interaction, every conversation, every moment of ordinary life. The lawyers Mr. Harrington had recommended were efficient and discreet. They began the redemption process immediately, filing paperwork with the Treasury Department, assembling documentation, building the legal framework necessary to convert Depression-era bonds into modern currency. The process was complex, they explained, involving multiple government agencies, historical verification, tax implications that required careful navigation. It would take time, 6 months at minimum, possibly longer. She signed documents she barely understood, trusting professionals she'd known for only weeks. The vulnerability of that trust kept her awake some nights. But what choice did she have? She couldn't navigate this alone. The world of high-value financial instruments was completely foreign to her, a language she'd never needed to learn. She had to rely on experts, had to believe they were guiding her correctly. The alternative was paralysis. Meanwhile, Her regular life continued with increasing absurdity. She still worked both jobs, the full-time position at the medical billing office and the weekend shifts at the bookstore. The money she earned still mattered, still went toward rent and groceries and the slow, grinding repayment of old debts. Her coworkers still complained about the same problems. Her manager still criticized her for small mistakes. The disconnect between her reality and theirs grew wider each day. Her younger sister called one evening, voice tight with stress. She was having trouble with her car, needed repairs she couldn't afford right now, wondered if she could borrow a few $100s until next month. The request was familiar. Her sister had borrowed money before, small amounts, usually repaid eventually. In the past, she would have said yes despite not having much to spare because family helped family, because her sister would do the same. Now she stood in her kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, aware that she could write a check for any amount her sister needed without even noticing the loss. Could buy her a new car, could pay off her mortgage, could solve every financial problem her sister would ever face. But she couldn't. Not yet. Not until the redemption was complete. Not until the money was actually accessible. Not until she'd figured out how to explain where it came from. So she said what she always said. She'd see what she could do, could probably spare $200 if that helped. Her sister thanked her with genuine gratitude, apologized for asking, promised to pay it back quickly. The conversation ended normally, but afterwards, she sat staring at nothing, feeling the weight of the secret press down harder. This was just the beginning. Once the money was real, once it existed in accounts she could access, every interaction with her family would carry this undercurrent. Every request for help would be shadowed by what she could do but wasn't doing yet. Every complaint about money would ring hollow against what she now possessed. The lawyers suggested she begin thinking about how she wanted to structure her life after redemption. She would need a comprehensive plan. Investment strategies, tax shelters, charitable giving, estate planning. The money needed to be protected, managed, put to work. They could recommend wealth managers, accountants, legal experts who specialized in sudden inheritance. The meetings were necessary but exhausting, forcing her to think in timescales and figures that felt alien. She found herself researching things she'd never considered before. How to maintain privacy with significant wealth. How to handle family requests for money. How to identify genuine friends from opportunists. How to prevent lifestyle inflation from destroying the security she'd just gained. The internet was full of cautionary tales. Lottery winners who'd lost everything within years. Inheritance recipients torn apart by family conflict. People who'd never learned to manage wealth and watched it evaporate through poor decisions and predatory advice. She became paranoid about her behavior, changing too noticeably. At work, she forced herself to care about the petty dramas and minor frustrations that had once seemed important. She participated in conversations about saving money on groceries, about finding deals on clothing, about the struggle to build any kind of savings. She maintained the performance of her old life while knowing it was already over, just waiting for paperwork to make it official. Her older brother texted one Saturday morning, asking if she wanted to meet for coffee. Unusual. They weren't particularly close, didn't typically spend time together outside of family obligations. She agreed, curious despite herself. They met at a chain coffee shop halfway between their apartments. He looked tired, she noticed, older than his years. The stress of his job was visible in the tension around his eyes. They made small talk for a while, circling around whatever had prompted the invitation. Finally, he mentioned that he'd been thinking about their grandmother, about the will, about how things had been divided. He wanted her to know that he felt bad about the jokes he'd made. About the armoire. It had been insensitive, he could see that now. Their grandmother must have had her reasons for giving her that particular item. He hoped there hadn't been hard feelings. She assured him there weren't, keeping her voice light, dismissive. It was fine. She'd gotten rid of the armoire easily enough. No big deal. He seemed relieved, then shifted to what she suspected was the real purpose of the meeting. He was thinking about their grandmother's house. The sale had gone through, the money distributed as planned. But he'd been wondering if maybe the lawyer had missed something. Their grandmother had always been careful with money. Seemed unlikely she'd have had so little saved. She felt her pulse quicken, but kept her expression neutral. What was he suggesting? He shrugged, uncomfortable. Just that maybe there was more somewhere. Another account, hidden savings, something. Their grandmother had lived through the Depression. That generation didn't trust banks entirely. They sometimes kept cash hidden or bought things that held value. Gold, maybe, or old coins. Had she noticed anything when she picked up the armoire? Any indication their grandmother might have hidden things? The question hung between them, casual on the surface, but she could hear the real inquiry beneath. He was fishing, not because he suspected anything specific, but because he wanted there to be more. Wanted to believe he hadn't received everything he was owed. She met his eyes and lied smoothly. She'd found nothing. The armoire had been empty except for dust. If their grandmother had hidden anything, it wasn't in that furniture. He accepted the answer, though she could see disappointment flicker across his face. They finished their coffee, making plans to get together again soon, plans they both knew would probably not materialize. Walking back to her car, she felt the encounter settle uncomfortably in her chest. This was the future. Suspicion, resentment, the constant calculation of who got what and whether it was fair. And it would only get worse once the truth came out. The lawyers called in early December with significant news. The Treasury Department had completed its initial verification. The bonds were authentic, the redemption was approved in principle, but there was a complication. The sum was large enough to trigger additional scrutiny. Multiple agencies needed to review the transaction. The IRS, obviously, but also the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, as a matter of protocol for any 8-figure redemption. It was standard procedure, nothing to worry about, but it would add time. Several months, most likely. She absorbed this information with something close to relief. More time meant more distance between now and the moment everything changed. More time to prepare, to plan, to figure out who she wanted to be when the money finally arrived. The lawyers were already working on the tax implications. The sum would be treated as inheritance, which offered some advantages. But the tax burden would still be substantial. Tens of millions. The number was abstract, impossible to conceptualize. She would pay more in taxes than most people earned in their entire lives. Christmas approached with its usual demands. Her family had always gathered at her older brother's house, a tradition that continued despite their grandmother's absence. This year felt different, heavier. The first holiday without her. Everyone seemed aware of it, moving more carefully around conversations, avoiding topics that led back to grief. She brought the wine she always brought, participated in the gift exchange she could barely afford, smiled at appropriate moments. Her younger sister pulled her aside at one point, thanking her again for the loan she'd provided weeks earlier. She wanted to pay it back, but money was still tight. Maybe after the new year? She waved it off, said not to worry about it. There was no rush. Her sister hugged her, called her generous, said she didn't know what she'd do without family to lean on. The words created a knot in her chest that stayed there long after the embrace ended. Her older brother was drinking more than usual. By evening, he was reminiscing about their grandmother with the particular sentimentality that alcohol enabled. He talked about lessons she'd taught him, about her strength, about how she'd held the family together through everything. Then, voice slightly slurred, he said something that made the room go quiet. He said it was a shame she'd had so little to leave them. She deserved better, had worked hard her whole life, and died with barely anything to show for it. The middle brother agreed, adding that it made him angry sometimes. Their grandmother should have been able to retire comfortably, should have traveled, should have enjoyed her final years. Instead, she'd struggled right up until the end. It wasn't fair. Their younger sister wiped her eyes, nodding. The conversation continued in this vein for a while, everyone contributing their own observations about their grandmother's financial struggles, about the modest estate, about the unfairness of it all. She sat quietly, letting them talk, feeling the secret burn inside her like something radioactive. They had no idea. None of them understood what their grandmother had actually possessed, what she'd chosen to do with it, who she'd chosen to give it to. They were constructing a narrative of noble poverty, of unfair hardship, and they were completely wrong. But she couldn't correct them. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Not completely. The holiday ended with the usual promises to stay in touch, to get together more often. She drove home through empty streets, exhausted by the performance she'd maintained all day. At home, she sat in darkness and let herself feel everything she'd been holding back. Anger at her siblings for their assumptions. Grief for her grandmother, who'd lived with this secret alone. Fear about what would happen when the truth finally emerged. And underneath everything else, a growing sense of isolation. The money was creating distance between her and everyone she knew, and it wasn't even fully hers yet. January brought a new year and new complications. One of her coworkers announced she was quitting, moving to a different city for a better opportunity. The news triggered a cascade of shift changes and scheduling chaos. Her manager asked if she could take on additional hours. The old version of herself would have said yes immediately. More hours meant more money, meant faster debt repayment, meant slight improvement in her precarious financial situation. Now the request felt like a test. Did she maintain the performance? Or did she begin the process of stepping back from a life she was about to leave anyway? She said yes, because saying no would have required explanation. But the additional hours felt increasingly surreal. She sat at her desk processing medical bills, entering codes, calling insurance companies to resolve claims, and the entire time her mind was elsewhere. How much longer would she do this? When would she quit? How did someone leave a job they'd held for 6 years without explaining that they no longer needed employment because they'd inherited over $300 million? The lawyers called in February with better news. The redemption process was advancing. Most of the government review was complete. They were entering the final stages, which involved establishing the accounts where the funds would be transferred, setting up the legal structures to protect and manage the wealth, coordinating with tax authorities to ensure proper withholding. They were talking about timelines now. Weeks, not months. Possibly as soon as late March or early April. The reality of it hit her harder than the initial discovery had. This was actually happening. Soon she would wake up, and the money would be real, accessible, hers to use. The thought was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. She began making lists, trying to organize her thoughts. What would she do first? Pay off her debts, obviously. Buy a better car. Move to a larger apartment, or maybe a house. But then what? How did someone spend $300 million? How did they even begin? The lawyers had suggestions. Diversified investments, real estate, charitable foundations, trusts for future generations. They spoke about preservation of capital, about making the money work for her, about setting up structures that would ensure financial security for life. It all made sense logically, but emotionally she struggled to connect with it. She'd spent her entire adult life worried about having enough money to survive the month. Now she needed to think about having too much money to spend in a lifetime. In early March, her younger sister called with news. She was pregnant. The announcement was joyful but tinged with anxiety. She was worried about costs, about maternity leave, about childcare expenses. Her husband's job was stable but didn't pay much. They were trying to figure out how to make it work. She wasn't asking for money, she insisted. Just sharing the news, maybe venting a little about the stress of it all. She congratulated her sister, expressed genuine happiness for her, promised to help however she could. After the call ended, she sat thinking about what was coming. In a few months, she'd have the resources to eliminate every financial worry her sister faced, could set up a trust for the baby, could pay for everything the child would ever need. But doing so would require explanation, would expose the inheritance, would change the family dynamic irrevocably. The gift would come with complications she couldn't yet predict. The lawyers called on a Tuesday in late March. The redemption was complete. All government approvals have been finalized. The bonds have been officially redeemed. After taxes and legal fees, the net amount being transferred to her accounts was $287,450,000. $287,450,000. The money would appear in her accounts within 48 hours. She should expect contact from the wealth management team they'd assembled. Her life was about to change significantly, and they wanted to ensure she had support through the transition. She thanked them mechanically and ended the call. Then she sat on her couch and stared at the wall for a long time. It was done. The secret that had defined the past several months was becoming reality. Tomorrow she would wake up and be one of the wealthiest people she'd ever heard of outside of news articles. Tomorrow she would have to decide what that meant, who she wanted to be, how she wanted to live. Tomorrow everything would be different. But today she was still herself. Still the person who worked 2 jobs and lived in a small apartment and worried about money. She had one more day of this life, and she found herself wanting to preserve it somehow, to hold onto it before it disappeared forever. She went to work, filed paperwork, answered phones, ate lunch at her desk. Her coworkers complained about the usual things. Her manager was irritated about something trivial. The day unfolded with comforting normality. That evening, she sat down and wrote letters. One to each of her siblings, trying to explain what had happened, what their grandmother had left her, why she hadn't told them immediately. The words came slowly, imperfectly. How did you tell people that your life had changed so fundamentally that you'd become almost a different person? How did you explain sudden wealth without sounding like you were bragging or apologizing? She wrote draft after draft, none of them quite right. The money appeared in her accounts on Thursday morning. She checked her phone banking app and saw numbers that made no sense. The balance was impossible, ridiculous, formatted in a way her app had never had a display before. She closed the app and opened it again. The number remained. It was real. She was wealthy in a way that changed the basic terms of existence. She could buy almost anything, go almost anywhere, do almost anything. The freedom was absolute and absolutely overwhelming. She called in sick to work. She couldn't face it, couldn't maintain the performance anymore. Instead, she stayed home, letting the reality settle. Her phone rang repeatedly. The wealth management team wanting to schedule meetings. The lawyers needing signatures on final documents. Her bank asking to verify the large deposit. She answered some calls, ignored others, moved through the day in a daze. By evening, she'd made one decision. She needed to tell her family. The letters weren't working, weren't capturing what needed to be said. This required a conversation, face-to-face, honest and direct. She texted her siblings, asking them to meet her on Saturday. All of them together. She had something important to discuss. They agreed, curious but not suspicious. They thought it was probably about their grandmother, about settling final details of the estate. They had no idea. Saturday came cold and gray. She'd arranged to meet at a neutral location, a private room at a restaurant she'd rented for the occasion. The expense had been trivial, meaningless against her new financial reality, but she'd still felt strange authorizing the charge. Her siblings arrived separately, her older brother first, then the middle brother, finally her younger sister. They settled into chairs, made small talk, waited for her to explain why she'd called this meeting. She told them she needed to share something about their grandmother's estate, about what she'd actually inherited, the armoire they'd all laughed about. She saw their expressions shift, curiosity sharpening into attention. She explained the hidden compartment, the bonds, the authentication, the redemption. She gave them the numbers, watching their faces as they tried to comprehend. $300 million, hidden in furniture they'd mocked, left specifically to her. The silence that followed was profound. Her older brother's face went through a series of expressions, disbelief, shock, confusion, finally settling into something harder. Her younger sister's eyes filled with tears, though whether from happiness or something else wasn't clear. The middle brother just stared, processing, calculating. The moment stretched out, fragile and terrible. Her older brother spoke first, voice tight. Why hadn't she told them? She'd known for months. She'd let them think their grandmother had died poor, had let them make plans based on false assumptions, had kept this massive secret while they'd struggled with their own problems. How could she do that? She tried to explain. The lawyers had advised discretion. The redemption process was complex. She needed time to understand what was happening before explaining it to others. The words sounded weak even as she said them. Her younger sister asked the question she'd been dreading. Why? Why had their grandmother left everything to her specifically? What made her special? What have they done wrong? The pain in her voice was genuine, cutting. She pulled out their grandmother's letter, the explanation written in shaky handwriting months before death. She read it aloud, hearing her grandmother's words give context to the decision. The letter emphasized her struggles, her kindness, her strength. It wasn't about the others being less deserving. It was about her needing it most. The explanation didn't satisfy them. Her older brother argued that they all had struggles, all had financial stress, all could have used help. Their grandmother's decision had been arbitrary, unfair, based on some perception that didn't match reality. He'd been helping his wife through cancer treatments. The middle brother was underwater on his mortgage. Their younger sister was about to have a baby with no financial cushion. They all needed money. Why had only she received it? She let them vent, understanding that the anger was part of processing impossible news. Eventually, when the initial shock faded slightly, she told them she wasn't planning to keep everything for herself. She'd already been working with financial advisors on how to help them, how to set up trusts and funds that would ease their financial burdens without creating dependency or entitlement. She wanted to honor their grandmother's wishes while also supporting her family. The conversation lasted hours, cycling through anger and confusion and grief and tentative acceptance. By the end, nothing was fully resolved. Her siblings needed time to process, to work through complex emotions about inheritance and fairness in their grandmother's hidden life. But they'd begun the process. The secret was out, and whatever came next would at least be honest. In the weeks that followed, relationships recalibrated slowly. Her older brother came around first, apologizing for his initial reaction, acknowledging that the situation wasn't her fault. They began meeting regularly, talking about family dynamics, and shared history in ways they never had before. Her younger sister took longer, working through feelings of inadequacy and comparison. Eventually, they found new ground, helped by the trust she established for the coming baby. The middle brother remained distant, not hostile, but not warm either. She accepted it. Not every relationship could be repaired or maintained. Some damage was permanent, and wealth had a way of exposing fractures that had always existed beneath the surface. She set up financial support for him anyway, through structures that didn't require close personal contact. He accepted it without comment. She quit both her jobs in April, giving proper notice, leaving on good terms. Her co-workers were shocked, curious about where she was going. She kept her explanations vague. Family inheritance, needed time to handle estate matters, wasn't sure what came next. Most accepted it without pressing. A few suspected more. She didn't confirm or deny anything. The apartment she'd lived in for years suddenly felt impossible. Too small, too connected to her old life, too full of memories of struggle. She moved into a house in late spring, nothing ostentatious but comfortable, spacious, hers without mortgage or landlord or precarity. The first night there, she walked through empty rooms and felt something she'd never quite experienced before. Security. Real, solid, unshakable security. She began figuring out what to do with wealth beyond simply having it. Charitable giving became important, supporting causes her grandmother would have cared about. Education, housing assistance, programs for single mothers and struggling families. She established foundations, set up endowments, used the money to create the kind of safety net she'd wished for during her own hardest years. Her grandmother's house, which had been sold, came back on the market unexpectedly. The buyers had fallen through. She bought it immediately, planning to restore it, preserve it, perhaps turn it into something useful for the community. Walking through the empty rooms, she felt her grandmother's presence more strongly than she had anywhere else. This was where the secret had been kept, where the armoire had stood for decades, where a woman had lived modestly while holding onto a fortune. The armoire itself she'd kept in storage, unable to part with it despite its size and impracticality. Eventually, she had it moved to the house, placed in the same bedroom where it had originally stood. She had it professionally restored, the wood repaired, the finish renewed, the hidden compartment maintained. It stood now as a memorial, a reminder of how appearance could be deceiving, how value could be hidden in places everyone dismissed. A year after the redemption, she returned to the storage facility where she'd first opened the hidden compartment. She walked to Unit 247, stood outside it, remembered the moment her life had changed. The shock, the disbelief, the slow understanding that her grandmother had seen her, had understood her struggles, had left her not just money but a message. You matter. Your struggle mattered. You deserve security, freedom, a life without constant fear. She'd spent the year learning to live with wealth, to navigate its complications, to use it in ways that felt meaningful rather than merely indulgent. She'd made mistakes, trusted wrong people occasionally, struggled with guilt and responsibility and the weight of having so much when others had so little. But she'd also done good things, had helped her family despite their complicated reactions, had supported causes she believed in, had begun building a life that honored her grandmother's gift. The siblings still struggled with it sometimes. Family gatherings carried undercurrents of awareness that hadn't existed before. Her wealth created subtle power dynamics that everyone felt, but nobody quite knew how to address. Her older brother sometimes made comments that carried resentment. Her younger sister occasionally seemed to resent asking for anything, even when help was offered freely. The middle brother maintained his distance. But there were good moments too. Her sister's baby was born healthy, in a hospital paid for by insurance she'd never have been able to afford otherwise. Her older brother's wife completed cancer treatment successfully, the stress of medical bills removed through support he'd finally accepted. The middle brother bought a new house, though he never acknowledged where the down payment had ultimately come from. They were finding their way, slowly, imperfectly. She thought about her grandmother often, wondered what her life had been like, carrying the secret of the bonds for decades. Wondered if she'd been tempted to use them, to change her circumstances, to live differently. Wondered if the weight of hidden wealth had been lonely, isolating, difficult. She understood now why her grandmother had waited so long to pass it on. Wealth changed everything, and some changes couldn't be reversed. The letter remained her most treasured possession. She kept it in a safe, protected, and preserved, reading it when she needed to remember why this had all happened. You're going to be fine now. Her grandmother had been right. She was fine. More than fine. She was secure, comfortable, able to help others, able to live without the constant fear that had defined her entire adult life. The gift wasn't just money. It was freedom. But she'd also learned what her grandmother had probably known, that wealth solves some problems while creating others. That family relationships were complicated by dramatic financial inequality. That sudden fortune didn't erase years of struggle or automatically create happiness. That money was a tool, powerful but limited, capable of great good, but not a solution to everything. She stood now in her grandmother's restored house, in the bedroom where the armoire stood, and felt the weight of everything that had happened. The discovery, the secret, the authentication, the redemption, the revelation, the aftermath. A year of transformation compressed into moments of reflection. She placed her hand on the armoire's surface, feeling the smooth restored wood under her palm. "Thank you," she said quietly, speaking to her grandmother, to the empty house, to the moment that had changed everything. "Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for trusting me. Thank you for the gift." Outside, the day was ordinary. Traffic moved on distant roads. Neighbors worked in their yards. The world continued as it always had, indifferent to individual stories of struggle and redemption. But inside the house, in this moment, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had occurred. Her grandmother, living modestly through her final years, had held on to a fortune and given it to the grandchild who needed it most, who had struggled without complaint, who had been kind without expectation of reward, who had simply endured because that was all she knew how to do. The bonds were gone now, converted into currency, distributed across accounts and investments and trusts. But their meaning remained. They represented her grandmother's final act of love, her last gift, her way of saying that struggle had been seen and would be rewarded, that perseverance mattered, that one person's quiet strength could change everything. She walked through the house one final time before leaving, checking rooms, ensuring everything was secure. At the door, She paused and looked back. The armoire stood visible from the hallway, solid and present, no longer broken or dismissed or mocked. It had held its secret well, had protected what was hidden, had waited patiently for the right moment and the right person. In the parking lot of her bank, weeks after that visit, she ran into her older brother unexpectedly. They'd both come to handle business, neither expecting to see the other. They stood talking for a while, conversation easier than it had been months earlier. He mentioned that he'd been thinking about their grandmother more lately, about how strange her life must have been, knowing what she had, choosing to live as she did. He said he understood now, at least partly, why she'd made the choice she had. Their grandmother had seen something in her that they'd missed. Not because they were bad siblings or didn't care, but because they'd been looking at the wrong things. They'd seen someone who struggled financially and assumed that was weakness or bad luck. Their grandmother had seen someone who struggled but never gave up, who helped others despite having little herself, who maintained kindness and dignity through circumstances that would have broken many people. He said he was sorry for how he'd reacted initially. Sorry for the jokes about the armoire, sorry for the anger when he learned the truth, sorry for not understanding sooner. He said he was proud of what she'd done with the inheritance, how she'd handled it with grace and thoughtfulness. Their grandmother would have been proud too. She thanked him, feeling something in her chest loosen slightly. Not complete reconciliation, not perfect understanding, but progress. Movement toward acceptance. They parted with genuine warmth, promising to see each other soon. As she drove away, she thought about how inheritance was never simple. It wasn't just about money or objects or what was written in legal documents. It was about meaning, about messages passed across generations, about one person's final opportunity to shape the future for someone they loved. Her grandmother's inheritance had been financial, yes, but it had also been emotional. A statement of value, of recognition, of hope. The story could have ended differently. The bonds could have been discovered by someone else, sold off, dispersed without thought to their meaning. The armoire could have been thrown away, its secret lost forever. She could have told her siblings immediately, causing different complications and conflicts. The money could have been managed poorly, spent foolishly, lost to bad decisions or predatory advisors. Any of these alternate paths could have led to vastly different outcomes. But this was the path that had unfolded. She'd found the bonds, authenticated them, redeemed them, told her family, navigated the aftermath as best she could. She'd made mistakes along the way, certainly. Had moments of selfishness, periods of paralysis, times when she'd handled things poorly. But she'd also honored her grandmother's trust, used the wealth thoughtfully, tried to be worthy of the gift she'd received. Now, as spring turned to summer and the first anniversary of the redemption approached, she found herself in a place she'd never imagined possible. Financially secure beyond measure, living comfortably but not ostentatiously, using her resources to help others while maintaining boundaries that protected her own well-being. Her relationship with her siblings was complicated but functional. Her life was her own in ways it had never been before. She thought about the girl she'd been a year ago, working 2 jobs, worried about rent, dismissing her inheritance as worthless. That version of herself felt distant now, almost like a different person. But she tried to stay connected to her, to remember what struggle felt like, to maintain empathy for people still living the life she'd left behind. The money hadn't made her a different person fundamentally. It had just removed obstacles, created options, provided freedom to become more fully herself. The summer brought changes she hadn't anticipated. Wealth, she discovered, attracted attention in ways that had nothing to do with announcing it. People sensed difference even when she tried to hide it. The way she held herself had shifted subtly. The constant tension that came from financial precarity had eased from her shoulders, her jaw, the space between her eyebrows. She moved through the world differently now, and people noticed even if they couldn't articulate what had changed. Her younger sister commented on it one afternoon when they met for lunch. She looked different, her sister said. Rested, maybe, or just less stressed. Was she doing yoga? Meditation? Seeing someone new? The The questions were innocent, curious, but they made her aware of how visible transformation could be. She deflected with vague answers about finally getting enough sleep, about making time for self-care. The words fell hollow but served their purpose. The wealth management team her lawyers had assembled proved invaluable in ways she hadn't expected. They didn't just manage investments and monitor accounts. They provided a buffer between her and the constant decisions that wealth demanded. Charitable requests arrived daily now. Somehow people had learned about her inheritance despite her attempts at discretion. Organizations seeking donations, individuals with hard luck stories, distant relatives she'd never met suddenly remembering family connections. The volume was overwhelming. Her team filtered everything, categorized requests, provided research on legitimate causes versus potential scams. They helped her develop a giving strategy that felt meaningful rather than reactive. Education remained a priority, specifically programs that helped single mothers return to school or gain job training. Housing assistance for families on the edge of homelessness. Medical debt relief for people crushed by healthcare costs. The causes she chose reflected her own fears, the disasters she'd narrowly avoided during her years of struggle. She established a foundation in her grandmother's name, giving the gift a public face while maintaining her own privacy. The foundation accepted applications, distributed grants, operated with the kind of transparency she'd wanted from charitable organizations when she'd been on the other side, hoping for help. Running it required hiring staff, renting office space, building infrastructure. The foundation became her work in a way her old jobs never had, purpose-driven rather than survival-focused. Her older brother's wife reached out in July, asking if they could meet privately. The request was unusual enough to make her nervous, but she agreed. They met at a coffee shop her sister-in-law chose, a quiet place where conversation could happen without interruption. Her sister-in-law looked better than she had in years, the cancer treatments finally behind her, color returning to her face. But something in her expression suggested this wasn't just a social visit. She started carefully thanking her for the support during the illness. The financial help had removed stress that might have impeded recovery, allowed her to focus on healing rather than bills. She was grateful, truly, but she was also worried. Worried about her husband, about how he was processing everything that had happened. He'd been trying to hide it, but the situation with the inheritance had affected him more deeply than he wanted to admit. Her brother felt inadequate, his wife explained. He'd spent his adult life trying to be the responsible older sibling, trying to succeed, to provide for his family. Then their younger sister had inherited a fortune he could never achieve through work, and it had shaken something fundamental in his self-concept. He was happy for her, genuinely, but he was also struggling with feelings he didn't know how to articulate. Envy, certainly, but also a sense that his efforts had been invalidated somehow, that years of hard work meant less in the face of pure luck. She listened without interrupting, feeling the complexity of the situation settle more heavily. She'd known her inheritance would affect her siblings, but she hadn't fully considered the deeper psychological impact. Money wasn't just practical. It carried meaning about worth, about success, about who deserved what. Her brother's identity had been built partly on being the stable one, the successful one. Her sudden wealth had disrupted that narrative in ways he was still processing. Her sister-in-law wasn't asking for anything specific, just wanted her to know, to maybe reach out to her brother in a way that acknowledged his struggle without making it worse. Maybe invite him to be involved in the foundation, give him a role that felt meaningful rather than charitable, something that let him contribute rather than just receive. The suggestion was thoughtful, and she promised to consider it carefully. The conversation stayed with her for days afterward. She'd been so focused on managing her own response to wealth that she hadn't fully considered how it reshaped everyone around her. Her siblings weren't just dealing with financial changes. They were renegotiating their understanding of family hierarchy, fairness, their own life choices. The inheritance had disrupted assumptions they'd built their identities around. She reached out to her older brother a week later, asking if he'd be interested in serving on the foundation's board. The role came with a stipend, Not charity, but compensation for genuine work. She needed someone with his business experience, his understanding of financial systems, his instinct for identifying sustainable solutions versus short-term fixes. The offer was genuine, not manufactured to make him feel better. She actually needed his skills. He was quiet for a long moment when she explained it. Then he asked if this was pity, if she was creating a role just to give him something to do. She met his eyes directly and told him the truth. The foundation was real, the work was real, and she was in over her head. She'd never run an organization, never managed staff, never dealt with the legal complexities of charitable giving at scale. She needed help from people she trusted, and he was one of the few people who fit that description. He accepted, though she could see him still processing, still working through complicated feelings. But it was a start, a way for him to engage with her new reality that didn't require just accepting handouts or pretending nothing had changed. They could work together, build something meaningful, transform their grandmother's gift into something that extended beyond just one family. The Foundation's first major grant went to a program she'd researched extensively. A transitional housing initiative for single mothers leaving abusive relationships. The program provided 6 months of stable housing while helping women secure employment, childcare, legal assistance. It was exactly the kind of safety net she'd wished existed during her hardest years, when one bad month could have spiraled into homelessness. She visited the facility before finalizing the grant, wanting to see the work firsthand. The director was a woman in her 50s who'd lived through similar struggles decades earlier and dedicated her life to helping others escape them. She walked through the building, showing small but clean apartments, the child care center, the computer lab where residents could take online courses or search for jobs. The simplicity of it was striking. Nothing fancy, just basic stability offered at the moment people needed it most. One of the residents, a woman probably close to her own age, was in the common area with her 2 young children. The director introduced them briefly. The woman looked exhausted but determined, the particular expression of someone holding themselves together through sheer will. They spoke for a few minutes, surface-level conversation about the program, about how things were going. The woman was careful, measured, clearly used to dealing with authority figures who held power over her housing situation. As she left, she thought about how easily she could have been that woman. A few different choices, a few worse circumstances, and she'd have been the one in transitional housing rather than the one funding it. The realization was uncomfortable but important. Wealth didn't make her better or smarter or more deserving. It just made her lucky. Lucky that her grandmother had saved those bonds. Lucky that she'd been the one chosen to inherit them. Lucky that the redemption had worked out. Luck compounded on luck, creating a life completely disconnected from merit. Her younger sister gave birth in August, a healthy baby boy. She visited the hospital the day after delivery, bringing gifts that had been carefully chosen to be generous without being overwhelming. A high-quality car seat, a versatile stroller, soft blankets, and practical clothing. Things any EM might bring, just slightly nicer versions. Her sister was exhausted but glowing, holding the baby with the careful intensity of new motherhood. They talked for a while about ordinary things. The delivery, the baby's feeding schedule, plans for the nursery. Then her sister grew quiet, looking down at the sleeping infant in her arms. She said she'd been thinking about their grandmother a lot lately, about how she'd raised children during much harder times, with fewer resources, less support, about how she'd managed to hold the family together despite everything. She said she hoped she could be half as strong. The comment opened a door to a conversation they'd been avoiding. Her sister asked what their grandmother had been like when she was younger, before age and illness had diminished her. She realized she didn't fully know. Most of her memories were from the later years, when their grandmother was already elderly, already shaped by decades of decisions and experiences. The vibrant younger woman who'd made the choice to buy and hide those bonds was mostly a mystery. She wished she'd asked more questions when there was still time. Wished she'd been curious about her grandmother's life beyond the role she'd played in theirs. What had she wanted? What dreams had she abandoned or achieved? What did she think about during quiet moments? Those questions had no answers now, and the absence felt like a failure. She'd been given this enormous gift, but barely knew the woman who'd given it. Her sister shifted the baby, preparing to nurse, and said something that surprised her. She said she understood now why their grandmother had chosen her specifically. Not because she was better or more deserving, but because she needed it most desperately and would use it most thoughtfully. Their grandmother had seen in her someone who understood what lack felt like, who wouldn't take well for granted, who'd remember what it meant to struggle even after the struggle was over. The words were generous, accepting in a way her sister hadn't been able to achieve earlier. Maybe motherhood had shifted her perspective. Maybe time had eased the initial sting. Or maybe she'd simply worked through her feelings and come out the other side. Whatever the reason, it felt like a gift. Forgiveness, or at least understanding. A way forward that didn't require pretending the situation wasn't complicated. She set up a substantial trust for the baby before leaving the hospital. Enough to cover education completely, from preschool through college and beyond. Enough to provide security without creating entitlement. The trust was structured carefully, with distributions tied to milestones and safeguards against misuse. Her nephew would never struggle the way she had, never face the desperation that came from having no safety net. That thought brought satisfaction deeper than she'd expected. Fall arrived with its usual abruptness, summer heat giving way to crisp mornings and earlier darkness. She'd been wealthy for 6 months now, and the novelty had worn into something more sustainable. She'd learned to manage the guilt that came with having so much while others had so little. Learned to set boundaries around giving without becoming callous. Learned to accept that she couldn't solve every problem or help every person who asked. The foundation was growing, adding staff, expanding programs. Her brother had proved invaluable, bringing organizational skills and business acumen she lacked. They worked well together, their relationship evolving into something more equal than it had been. He was earning his role through genuine contribution, and that seemed to ease whatever inadequacy he'd felt initially. They weren't just siblings anymore. They were colleagues, partners in building something meaningful. Her middle brother remained distant, though not hostile. She'd learned to accept his choice, to respect his need for space, even if she didn't fully understand it. Some people couldn't handle dramatic shifts in family dynamics. Some people needed to maintain clear boundaries to protect their sense of self. She'd given him the support he was willing to accept and let go of trying to force closer connection. The armoire remained in her grandmother's house, which she decided to keep rather than sell again. The house had become a kind of sanctuary, a place she visited when she needed to feel connected to the past, to remember where she'd come from. She'd furnished it simply, maintaining the modest aesthetic her grandmother had preferred. It wasn't a showpiece. It was a memorial, a reminder, a physical link to the woman who'd changed everything. She sometimes sat in the bedroom where the armoire stood, thinking about the moment she discovered the hidden compartment. That instant when everything had shifted, when her understanding of reality had been completely rewritten. It felt like years ago rather than months. So much had changed since then. But the memory remained vivid, detailed, precious. The moment her life had divided into before and after. In October, she received an invitation to speak at a conference on inherited wealth. The organizers had somehow learned her story, though she'd been careful about privacy. They wanted her to share her experience, to talk about the psychological impact of sudden inheritance, the challenges of managing family relationships, the responsibility that came with unearned wealth. She declined initially, uncomfortable with the idea of public exposure. But the invitation stayed in her mind, refusing to be dismissed completely. Maybe there was value in sharing what she'd learned. Not as self-promotion or celebration, but as education. Others would inherit wealth, would face similar challenges, would struggle with the same complicated emotions. If her experience could help them navigate it more successfully, maybe that was another way to honor her grandmother's gift. Maybe transformation should be shared rather than hoarded. She called the conference organizers back, agreeing to speak, but insisting on certain conditions. No use of her real name, no photographs, no recording of the session. She'd share her story but maintain privacy. They agreed, understanding that wealthy individuals often require discretion. The session was scheduled for November, giving her time to prepare remarks that felt honest without being self-indulgent. Preparing the speech forced her to organize thoughts she'd been avoiding. What had the inheritance actually meant? Beyond the practical benefits, beyond financial security, what had fundamentally changed? She realized the deepest shift was internal. She no longer moved through the world from a position of scarcity. Decisions were no longer dominated by fear of lack, by the constant calculation of whether she could afford something, whether spending here meant sacrifice there. The absence of that fear had changed everything, had opened mental space she'd never had before. She could think about what she wanted rather than just what she needed, could consider possibilities rather than just surviving present circumstances, could imagine futures beyond mere stability. The freedom was profound and, she suspected, invisible to people who'd never experienced the alternative. Those born into security couldn't fully understand what it meant to live without it. The conference was in a hotel in a city 3 hours away, attended by wealth managers, estate lawyers, financial advisors, and a small number of inherited wealth recipients. The audience was strange, full of people who dealt with money at scales most people never encountered. She sat through other presentations, learning about tax strategies and investment vehicles and legal structures designed to preserve wealth across generations. The information was useful but also alienating, a reminder of how far she'd traveled from ordinary life. When her turn came, she spoke without notes, sharing her story as simply as she could. The struggling years, the inheritance that seemed worthless, the discovery, the redemption, the aftermath. She talked about the guilt, the isolation, the complicated family dynamics, the responsibility of having resources others desperately needed. She talked about her grandmother, about trying to honor a gift she barely understood, about learning to be wealthy in a way that felt ethical rather than just indulgent. The room was quiet when she finished. Then questions came, thoughtful and genuine. Others in the audience shared similar experiences, similar struggles. A woman in her 30s had inherited from her father and struggled with siblings who felt overlooked. A man in his 50s had received a surprise inheritance from a distant relative and found it complicated his marriage in unexpected ways. The stories varied, but themes repeated. Inheritance was never simple. Wealth changed everything, always, whether people wanted it to or not. After the session, several people approached her privately. They thanked her for her honesty, said her story resonated with their own experiences. One woman, probably in her 40s, said she'd inherited from her mother 3 years earlier and still hadn't told her adult children. She was afraid of how it would change their relationships, afraid they'd become dependent or resentful or stop striving in their own lives. The fear had isolated her completely. She lived with this enormous secret and couldn't share it with the people closest to her. She listened, recognizing the loneliness that had been her reality for months, carrying knowledge that separated her from everyone she knew. She told the woman what her own experience had taught her. Secrets eroded relationships more effectively than difficult truths. The isolation was worse than whatever complications honesty would bring. Eventually, the secret would come out anyway. Better to control that revelation than have it discovered accidentally. The woman nodded, eyes wet, clearly knowing this already but needing to hear someone else say it. They exchanged contact information, promising to stay in touch. The conference had created a temporary community of people dealing with similar situations, all of them navigating wealth they'd done nothing to earn, all of them trying to figure out what responsibility came with unearned resources. The connection felt valuable, rare. Driving home that evening, she thought about community and isolation, about how wealth created both. She had resources to solve almost any problem, but fewer people who understood her actual life. Her old friends couldn't relate to her circumstances anymore. Her family was still adjusting. The gap between her reality and theirs grew wider despite her efforts to bridge it. Maybe this was always the trade-off. Security but separation. Freedom but loneliness. By the time she reached home, she'd made a decision. She'd be more open about her situation, within reason. Not broadcasting it publicly, but not hiding it from people she wanted genuine relationships with. The secret had served its purpose during the initial transition. Now, it was becoming a barrier to authentic connection. She needed people who knew her fully, who understood her reality, even if they couldn't relate to it personally. She called her younger sister that night, something she rarely did without reason. They talked about nothing important for a while, the baby's development, upcoming holidays, small family news. Then she said she'd been thinking about their grandmother a lot lately. About the gift, about what it meant, about responsibility. Her sister listened quietly, letting her talk without interruption. She said she was grateful for how her sister had handled everything. For working through complicated feelings, for not letting resentment poison their relationship, for understanding that their grandmother's choice hadn't been about favoritism or love, but about need. She said she hoped they could stay close despite the weirdness of the situation, despite how money changed dynamics, whether people wanted it to or not. Her sister's voice was warm when she responded, saying she'd been thinking similar things. The inheritance was strange, yes, but family was still family. They'd figure it out together. The conversation didn't resolve everything. Couldn't resolve everything. But it was honest, which mattered more than neat conclusions. They were finding their way toward a new normal, whatever that would look like. The path was uncertain, but at least they were walking it together rather than separately. December brought the first anniversary of her grandmother's death and the second holiday season without her. The grief was different now, less raw but deeper somehow. She missed her grandmother not just as the person who'd raised her, but as the woman who'd made an impossible choice and trusted her with the consequences. She wished she could talk to her now, tell her how things had unfolded, ask questions that hadn't occurred to her when there was still time to ask. She visited the cemetery on the anniversary, bringing flowers her grandmother had loved. The headstone was simple, just name and dates, no elaborate epitaph. Standing there, she tried to find words adequate to what she felt. Gratitude, obviously, but also confusion, responsibility, determination to be worthy of the gift. The attempt at articulation failed. Some things were too large for words, too complex for neat expression. Instead, she stood in silence, letting herself feel the full weight of the year. The discovery, the transformation, the ongoing navigation of wealth she barely understood. The foundation bearing her grandmother's name. The family relationships slowly healing or not healing. The person she was becoming in response to circumstances she'd never anticipated. All of it connected back to this grave, to the woman who'd seen her clearly and chosen to change everything. The year ahead would bring new challenges, she knew. The foundation would expand, requiring more of her time and energy. Family dynamics would continue evolving in unpredictable ways. She'd keep making mistakes, keep learning what it meant to be wealthy ethically, keep trying to honor her grandmother's trust. The work was endless, complex, and important. She was ready for it now in a way she hadn't been a year ago. Walking back to her car, she looked back at the grave one final time. A simple marker in an ordinary cemetery, giving no hint of the woman's hidden life or the fortune she'd preserved through decades. Appearances were deceiving. Her grandmother had taught her that. Value existed in unexpected places. Wealth could be a burden or a gift depending on how it was held and used. And love sometimes expressed itself through trust rather than words, through believing someone was strong enough to handle what was being offered. She'd proven herself worthy of that trust, she believed. Not perfectly, not without mistakes, but genuinely. She'd taken an overwhelming gift and used it thoughtfully, maintained her values despite the temptation to abandon them, stayed connected to her own history, even as her circumstances changed dramatically. Her grandmother would have been proud. That belief sustained her through moments of doubt and confusion. She was doing her best. It was enough. The drive home took her past her old apartment building, where she'd lived during the years of struggle. She slowed, looking up at the window that had been hers. The curtains were different now, someone else's life unfolding in that small space. She remembered the person she'd been then, constantly worried, constantly calculating, constantly aware of how little margin for error existed. That person felt distant now, almost like a character in a story rather than her actual past self. But she tried to stay connected to her, to remember what that life had felt like. The fear was important to remember. It kept her grounded, kept her grateful, kept her committed to using wealth in ways that helped people escape similar circumstances. The day she forgot what struggle felt like was the day she'd risk becoming exactly the kind of wealthy person she didn't want to be. Disconnected, entitled, convinced that money was earned rather than largely a product of luck and circumstance. She wouldn't forget. That was her promise to her grandmother, to herself, to the person she'd been and the person she was becoming. She'd remember. She'd honor the gift, not just by using it wisely, but by staying connected to the reality most people lived. By remembering that wealth was responsibility, not merit badge. By understanding that she'd been given not just money, but the obligation to make it matter beyond herself. The future was uncertain, full of challenges she couldn't predict and complications she'd need to navigate carefully. But she faced it with resources, with support, with the foundation her grandmother had provided in that hidden compartment so carefully preserved. She faced it ready to build something meaningful from an impossible gift, ready to transform luck into purpose, wealth into impact, gratitude into action, ready to prove, over and over, that she'd been the right choice, that her grandmother's trust hadn't been misplaced, that broken armoires sometimes contained exactly what was needed, even when nobody else could see it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.